prazer de abrir essa sessão da conferência da professora Clara Han, que se intitula Cotidianos Divergentes, a Doença e o Fluxo da Vida Cotidiana. E tenho também o prazer de apresentá-la. A Clara Han é professora no Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade de Johns Hopkins. Ela fez doutorado em Antropologia Social na Universidade de Harvard e também fez o doutorado em Medicina pela Harvard Medical School, ambos em 2007. E ela se graduou em Biologia Molecular e em Relações Internacionais pela Universidade de Princeton, em 1997. As pesquisas de Clara Han giram em torno, basicamente, de alguns eixos, como a experiência da doença, particularmente em contextos marcados pela privação econômica, a experiência da morte e do morrer, e a articulação entre violência, aflição, cuidado e parentesco. E as pesquisas dela se desenvolvem tanto na América Latina quanto nos Estados Unidos e leste asiático. Na América Latina, ela conduziu pesquisas em bairros de baixa renda em Santiago, no Chile, que começaram em 1999. E desse trabalho resultou um dos seus livros, Life in Debt, A Vida em Dívida, Tempos de Cuidado e Violência no Chile Neoliberal, que foi publicado em inglês pela editora da Universidade da Califórnia, em 2012. E tem uma tradução também em espanhol, publicada em 2022 pela Long Editores. Esse livro, com base em mais de uma década de pesquisa, que começou em 99, como eu já disse, e foi até 2010, analisa os impactos na vida cotidiana das famílias de baixa renda, das políticas neoliberais no Chile, que foram adotadas no país durante a ditadura, mas permaneceram nas décadas seguintes, explorando as lentas mudanças na subjetividade e as ambivalências entre cuidado e negligência nas relações cotidianas, interpenetradas pelos efeitos das políticas voltadas à pobreza, à saúde mental e aos direitos humanos, que buscavam acertar contas, na lei das dívidas, com essa população, diante das muitas formas de violação que lhe foram infligidas. Naquele contexto, a precariedade econômica vivida somavam-se às marcas da violência sofrida durante a ditadura. Sempre atenta às pessoas, é uma característica do trabalho da Clara, e aos movimentos da vida no bairro, a Clara analisa, assim, os enredamentos que vão mudando e tecendo a vida cotidiana em face da insegurança econômica e da violência estatal. E ainda tendo o Chile como referência, ela concluiu um livro a ser publicado, um livro que vai ser publicado ainda pela Fordham, pela editora da Universidade de Fordham, que chama-se Echoes of a Death, Ecos de uma Morte, que é um livro sobre a violência policial, que trata das formas como uma única morte nas mãos da polícia, num bairro de baixa renda, ocupado pela polícia em Santiago, como ecoa na vida de familiares, entre vizinhos, na comunidade, e dentro das instituições estatais. Ainda pensando na América Latina, em 2020 e 2021, a partir de um financiamento da National Science Foundation, a Fundação Nacional de Ciências, num edital dirigido à Covid, ela coordenou com a Vina Das um estudo que se chama A Implementação das Medidas Adotadas durante a Pandemia da Covid-19, Implicações para as Desigualdades Intrafamiliares em 5 países. E entre os países em que foi desenvolvida a pesquisa estavam o Brasil e o Chile, além da Índia, da Coreia do Sul e da China. E no Brasil, essa pesquisa acompanhou 17 famílias que vivem em cidades tanto do Sudeste, Campinas, São Paulo, Rio, quanto da Amazônia, Belém, Altamira e Ariquemes, em Rondônia. E contando com uma equipe de antropólogas e antropólogos brasileiros de diversas instituições aqui no país. Os primeiros resultados dessa pesquisa vão ser publicados num dossiê editado pela Camila Pierobon, que na época que participou dessa pesquisa, né? E por Marjorie Murray, que é do Chile, e vai ser publicado pela revista Sexualidade, Saúde e Sociedade. Enfim, aguardemos esses primeiros resultados. E eu destaco ainda que a professora Clara Han editou também, em colaboração com a Vina Das, a coletânea Viver e Morrer no Mundo Contemporâneo, um compêndio. É uma obra que envolve várias pesquisas de vários países, e assim como ela é coeditora da série Thinking from Elsewhere, né? Pensando de um outro lugar, que é uma premiada série da editora da Universidade de Fordham também. E na Johns Hopkins, onde ela trabalha, ela foi uma das fundadoras de uma iniciativa que se chama Respostas Críticas à Violência Anti-Asiática. E ela participa de uma rede que se chama Forms of Life, Formas de Vida, nucleada em Paris, financiada pelo CNRS. E é pesquisadora também de uma rede internacional de pesquisadores enfrentando a violência extrema, também nucleada na França. E, atualmente, ela é presidente da Sociedade de Antropologia Médica nos Estados Unidos, Society for Medical Anthropology. E mais, agora eu queria falar daquilo que mais recentemente ela tem feito com as suas pesquisas que se voltaram para a Coreia, focalizando particularmente a Guerra da Coreia e a partição das duas Coreias. Nessa linha de pesquisas, ela publicou um livro que se chama Seeing Like a Child, ver como uma criança, que recebeu o prêmio de livro sênior de 1922 da Associação de Antropologia Feminista, e foi finalista do prêmio Victor Turner em escrita etnográfica, também em 22. Eu gostaria de me deter um pouco aqui nesse livro, não apenas pelo meu apreço a esse livro, mas por ser um trabalho que articula de uma forma bastante singular biografia e antropologia, em torno de um dos seus temas principais, que são as experiências de violência e de aflição. Ela analisa nesse livro a herança da Guerra da Coreia, articulando violência, aflição e parentesco, no que ela chama de a perspectiva da criança, a partir das suas próprias memórias do que foram, em sua vida, as marcas da guerra vivida por seus pais. Lembranças que se misturam às da doença da sua mãe, durante sua infância e de seus irmãos. E, quando ela já era adulta, a partir do relato dos cuidados à saúde, muito debilitada, do seu pai, até sua morte, visto sob a perspectiva de outra criança, aí a sua filha. Clara Han é filha de pais coreanos, professores e pesquisadores. O pai dela era professor de física, que fugiram do norte para o sul da Coreia durante a guerra, num processo de deslocamento que culminou com a migração para os Estados Unidos, o que implicou interrupções, ou rupturas mesmo, nas relações de parentesco e com a língua coreana. É comovente, e eu poderia dizer desconcertante, a forma delicada com que a antropóloga nos coloca diante da sua biografia, fazendo-nos compartilhar sua intimidade na ambivalência dos afetos
em uma proposta de apresentar uma etnografia em primeira pessoa, articulada a segunda pessoa e a terceira pessoa, em distintas configurações que interconectam, afetam e dão sentido ao relato do eu, existente, por definição, em relações, na opacidade das relações, para citá-la junto com nessa expressão que é dela e da Vina Das. É marcante no livro a presença do inesperado e a mudança imprevisível de lugares que a vida cotidiana vai tecendo, redefinindo as perspectivas. A filha, ela, né, que fala, e ela se torna mãe, e desse lugar vê como uma criança a partir do olhar e da voz de outra criança, que é a sua filha. E a relação com a língua coreana, que foi suprimida e interditada no seu mundo da infância, e ela é recuperada pela antropóloga, que a traz de volta ao pai, que havia perdido, mas já na ausência da mãe falecida. A mãe que queria tanto, sem ter conseguido preservar a língua e as conexões familiares. E ela tem no corpo do pai e na voz do pai essa possibilidade, com uma viagem que ele fez já no final da sua vida, finalmente, à Coreia, onde ele pôde rever os parentes e voltar a falar coreano. Enfim, ela descreve um mundo de interconexões que vinculam, mas sufocam, separam e voltam a enredar. Como ela diz, eu cito, é precisamente porque os irmãos são parte de nós que nós também aprendemos a nos separar. Assim, o modo como se herda uma guerra se faz nessas relações que compõem o parentesco e a vida cotidiana, atravessadas pela violência e pela aflição. E a herança é tudo isso. Aquilo que emerge nas relações e vai sendo incorporado nas muitas cenas vividas e que passa a fazer parte de nós, como aflição e também como felicidade num mundo de pertencimento. Metodologicamente, em momento algum, a autora se refere à ideia de uma autoetnografia, mas ao contrário, ela explora de dentro as possibilidades intrínsecas à etnografia, que permitem falar em primeira pessoa. Através da perspectiva da criança que não viveu a guerra, ela que não viveu a guerra e é nascida, é uma cidadã norte-americana, né, estadunidense, é a partir dessa perspectiva que ela escreve a partir das memórias de uma infância atravessada por uma experiência que é dos pais e não dela. Mas ela escreve como antropóloga, cujo trabalho de campo a levou a buscar recuperar, de alguma forma, os mundos devastados dos seus pais, em viagens à Coreia e já adulta no aprendizado da língua coreana, que ela não tinha podido falar, permitindo encontrar parentes e reconectar afetivamente relações rompidas pela guerra e pela doença da mãe. Então, escrevendo de dentro de Memórias da Infância, ela inverte o método habitual das ciências sociais, que coloca a experiência dentro da transmissão de narrativas históricas existentes, para, em vez disso, ver como uma criança, o que implica reformular a noção de herança e considerá-la não a partir da transmissão intergeracional, exterior ao sujeito que recebe a herança, mas por uma perspectiva que é da criança e se torna da antropóloga. É uma proposta metodológica, na qual nenhum enquadramento está dado a priori, mas começa a se formar pelas múltiplas e variadas combinações das formas como se aprende, na vida cotidiana, a habitar um mundo atravessado pela violência e pela aflição. Bom, eu poderia falar muito, porque a obra pode ser lida de várias maneiras e é uma obra muito bonita. Mas vocês estão aqui para ouvir a Clara, então eu vou passar a palavra para a Clara e sem deixar de antes agradecer muitíssimo, em nome da Ampox e dos cientistas sociais brasileiros, pela sua presença nesse congresso. Então, como eu já disse, a palestra se intitula Cotidianos Divergentes, a doença e o fluxo da vida cotidiana. Muito bem-vinda, Clara.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that very moving introduction, and also for the way in which you're receiving seeing like a child, which I think is a question of what is the intrinsic potential of ethnography. I think that this is the methodological kind of commitment that is there. Is I think what I'm going to also hopefully try to give expression to today. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'd also like to give my heartfelt thanks to Professors Gregori and Professor Bashir for the invitation to give a keynote at Unpox, to be able to share my research. This is all the more meaningful because the invitation marks a return to Campinas almost exactly 1 year after a workshop organized by Daniele Rui and Camila Birobon, who's now at the Museo Nacional, which brought together researchers for the first time in person from Chile and Brazil, who had undertaken the multi-country project on the social profile of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to see if this. This multi-country study, led by myself and Veena Das, assembled researchers working what we hoped would be 5 countries. It ended up being 4 countries because we couldn't actually undertake the research in China, to comparatively explore the texture of household decision-making in low-income households under pandemic movement restrictions and amidst scientific uncertainty produced by a novel virus. At the workshop in Campinas last year, I was struck by how this research project had taken on its own life, creating new projects, such as the Long COVID project led by Daniele Rui, and a knowledge network that is deeply engaged with questions of the everyday, the ordinary, and knowledge from the region of the feminine. As one expression of this knowledge network, Camila Pirobon and Marjorie Murray, who's at La Católica in Santiago, have brought together the first publications of this research from Chile and Brazil, and will hopefully be published in the journal Sexualidad, Salud y Sociedad of the Institute of Social Medicine. So this talk is based on the paper that I am publishing as part of this dossier. So now I begin. In the anthropological literature, at least 2 different dominant frameworks have come to define research on the COVID-19 pandemic. On the one hand, the pandemic is framed as a dramatic event and understood in terms of the rupture or crisis in everyday life. The analogy is made to a large-scale adverse event that dramatically alters everyday life, daily life through movement restrictions, temporary economic measures, and scientific uncertainty. In this framework, everyday life is taken for granted as the site of banal routines or mere repetition, rather than that which is achieved through the labors of care and the attention to detail. We may consider, for example, scenes of women doing the chores, cooking, cleaning, sewing, picking up the children, that knit the everyday in domestics marked by violence. The ways in which small phrases uttered within the domestic smooth over and contain the madness that threatens to overwhelm intimate kinship in a milieu marked by state violence, or the ways in which madness cannot be absorbed by intimate relations or state institutions, but nevertheless, it is from within this tattered and frayed everyday life that care is offered. That everyday life is achieved also means that it is fragile and cannot be assumed to exist independent of these labors. A second assumption undergirding this framework is the idea that the subject of illness comes into being through a moment of crisis that lies outside of the everyday, as it were. This is a picture of the subject constituted in relation to an event of illness that breaks in on everyday life. On the other hand, the COVID-19 pandemic has been seen as that which reveals pre-existing social determinants. Invisibilized larger forces of inequality led to stark differences in COVID-19 morbidity and mortality, and the burdens of household care, differences that burst into public discourse. Work on structural violence has shown how large-scale historical forces are both drivers of and powerful legitimators of inequality. But the question for ethnography is how to keep in view both the overall context marked by such inequalities and the texture of everyday life in which people navigate precarity. The revelation of structural violence is not the end of the story, but rather the starting point to engage how people in conditions of chronic poverty cobble together care and encounter institutions. In either of these frameworks that I've just presented, the flux of everyday life recedes from view. In the early months of the pandemic, Veena Das and I led a multi-country study on household decision-making under pandemic movement restrictions, drawing on long-term relationships that our research team had with low-income households and neighborhoods in Chile, Brazil, India, and South Korea. We designed and administered a bi-weekly household illness and financial survey instrument and conducted follow-up interviews with low-income households. The fieldwork occurred through WhatsApp because of remote conditions, WhatsApp phone calls, and video chats. As part of this study, I returned to households in La Pincoya, the neighborhood where my first book, Life in Debt, is based, and where I began fieldwork in 1999. From May 2020 through November 2020, I met online every other week, and in some cases every week, with 5 households whom I have continued to sustain relationships with now over 25 years. In this essay, I bring one of these households into view, Ruby and Hector's household, whose struggles I followed in Life in Debt, as Ruby sought to secure official recognition of Hector as a political prisoner under Pinochet, and she was doing this in 2005 in the wake of the Valech Commission. My interests are twofold. First, I am interested in the way in which the repeated surveys and interviews shifted our seeing COVID-19 and pandemic measures as events that crashed in from the outside to seeing the pandemic as the overall context in which households contended with multiple crises. These crises were folded into or internal to everyday life, pressures, contingencies, and dark undercurrents in intimate life, and in the cascade of forces that leave residues on relations. In a sense, the story of COVID is the story of this texture of everyday life. Second, I treat as an open question the fact that I have been in conversation with members of these households for now over 2 decades. The sedimentation of experience here does not lead to greater transparency of the social. Rather, it seems to usher forth a knotted history that cannot simply be told in narrative form. Before I turn to Ruby's household and her wider kinship network, I briefly address the government's pandemic policies as they unfolded in the wider context of the Estadio Social, the social uprising in Chile. On March 22nd, 2020, the Piñera government instituted dynamic quarantines based on municipality-based case rates. In some low-income neighborhoods, quarantines led to protests due to the resulting acute unemployment and hunger. Social uprising protests, which burst into the streets in October 2019, were effectively shut down in the center of the city as COVID case rates increased. Scientific uncertainty was a condition of any pandemic policy, given the novelty of the virus, the unpredictable modalities of contagion, and the still ongoing production of the short and long-term health sequelae from infection. Yet the government's projection of certainty and the Ministries of Health's unwillingness to engage with key medical bodies, such as the Colegio Médico de Chile, intensified an already existing mistrust in the government. By the time that we began this study in mid-May 2020, the government had reinstituted a curfew and quarantine. After relaxed movement restrictions in April ushered forth a sharp increase in COVID cases and a near collapse of public health sector facilities. Quarantine conditions restricted leaving one's house to, quote, essential workers or those who secured a COVID-19 permit from the Carabineros of Chile, the police, the street police, which operates under military jurisdiction. Those circulating the city without a permit could be detained and given prison time. The need for circulation, either locally or across the city for employment, care, paperwork, hospital visitation, and so forth, led the government to proliferate a Byzantine web of permits that became increasingly difficult to navigate. To mitigate the economic impacts of movement restrictions, the government instituted in May 2020 a bono de emergencia, as well as a 3-month emergency household income and box of groceries for households that qualified as poor on the basis of their ficha de protección social score. Yet these measures proved to be unpredictably implemented and materially insufficient. Propelled by street protests, opposition parties proposed and ultimately succeeded in passing a law that allowed for a voluntary 10% withdrawal from the workers' own private pensions held by the AFP, Asociación de Fondos Provisionales. Workers could use their banked financial resources as a resource to help them in the present. The first withdrawal occurred at the end of June 2020. The second was authorized in December 2020, and the third authorized in April 2021. In La Pincoya, even in the early days of quarantine, street protests continue nearly on a nightly basis, with police using tear gas and youth creating barricades. But these back and forth confrontations with the police were contemporaneous with other forms of street policing, such as drug raids, that had intensified over the past several years. Negotiating bureaucracies of safe passage and household quarantine were absorbed in the already ongoing encounters with social work, family court, drug offenses, and house arrest. Differential risks were weighed, such as the fear of COVID and possibly falling ill from infection, the financial risk of losing income, and the legal risks of being caught without official safe passage under movement restrictions. As households faced intensified precarity due to job loss or lost income due to movement restrictions, older forms of solidarity emerged, such as ollas comunes. Yet in returning to these surveys and interviews now 5 years later, I also find that COVID rarely surfaces as a distinct theme throughout the interviews. Indeed, in the case of Ruby's household, while COVID marks the overall context in which life unfolded, the story here is one of contending with addiction, mental illness, multiple diagnoses, domestic violence, policing, and incarceration. How to render both the eventedness within a mode of being and the slow saturations that also lend that mode of being its quality. Let me give a brief overview of the kinship relations that will make their appearance in this story. When I began working in La Pincoya in 1999, Ruby and Hector resided in Ruby's mother's house with their 2 small children and expecting a third. By 2005, they secured a state housing subsidy to buy a house down the street. With extensive social contacts in and beyond the neighborhood from a work history in the municipality, NGOs, and as the former president of the neighborhood council, Ruby has become an extra local broker of sorts for her expanded kinship network, as well as for her neighbors. She was the person in the household whom I surveyed and interviewed, although her husband Hector was often next to her in their bedroom while we spoke, with her children and grandchildren sometimes entering the room. Just up the hill from their house is Ruby's mother's house, where Ruby's second oldest sister, Lorena, and her elder brother, Jose, continued to reside with their families. Lorena had suffered from years of domestic violence at the hands of her husband, Juan, who passed away 4 years earlier, 4 years before the pandemic. Out of her 6 children, ranging from middle school age to mid-20s, one son was currently incarcerated. A younger high school-aged son had left the neighborhood to live with a girlfriend after residing on and off in Ruby's house to try to overcome an addiction to pasta base. The eldest daughter had recently left her grandmother's house to live with her partner in her partner's parents' house. Her second eldest daughter lived one street down with her husband, an older man, while her youngest daughter, still in middle school, was in and out of school, sometimes living with an older boyfriend outside of the neighborhood. Only one child, her adolescent son, born with severe developmental disability, Brian, whom we will come to meet again throughout this essay, remained with Lorena in their dwelling in Lorena's house. Ruby's eldest sister, Soledad, lived one street over from Ruby with her partner, Johnny, and one son, Pablo, who several years earlier had smoked marijuana prensada and had ended up incarcerated for a year. Johnny had an on and off addiction to pasta base and could not hold down a stable job. Soledad herself had suffered from a benign yet growing brain tumor, while up until recently working as a caretaker in the neighborhood's large daycare facility that stood right next to her mother's house. 2 of Ruby's children were now living with their own partners in dwellings made by expanding the construction of Ruby's and Hector's house. Their eldest son, David, lived with his partner, her middle school-aged daughter, and their elementary-aged daughter. Ruby's son, Emilio, lived with his partner, at the time pregnant with their first child. Her youngest son, Tito, was in his second year of high school, but school closures and movement restrictions meant that he was now largely confined to the house. As we can see here, it is not that the household and the family are intervened on by the state as if from the outside. Rather, there are multiple encounters with the state that are folded into each other, the stories of which we, as anthropologists, come in the middle of, not the end or the beginning. So let me begin in the middle of the story of illness. By late May 2020, Ruby's youngest son, Tito, now a teenager, had not left the house in 2 months. In the days following the first quarantine, Tito experienced what Ruby described as a, quote, crisis. She had been sleeping next to Tito when suddenly he let out a cry and his body began to jump, or saltaba, off the bed. She and her eldest son rushed him to the SAPU, the urgent care, where he told the physician he had smoked marijuana prensada. The physician sent him home with natural remedies, St. John's wort chiclets, and eating chili when he felt nauseous. But Tito's appetite declined and he began losing weight. Ruby detailed what it took for her to entice him to eat busco chocolate, hago su leche, and set up care for him in the community mental health center, the COSAM, remarking with a hint of surprise in her voice that it took the quarantine for her to pay attention to Tito. Up until then, she caught small hints of a quiet, unfolding illness, but those hints were quickly submerged in the rhythms of working nights, taking care of her elderly mother and her 2 sisters. While we were on WhatsApp video chat, Ruby called on Tito to come to the dinner table and cajoled him to greet me over the phone. Pale and rather thin, Tito smiled awkwardly as Ruby remarked to me that the quarantine had allowed for a, quote, reencuentro con la familia. She turned to Tito. Isn't that right? It was difficult for me to gauge the tone of these remarks, but it felt as if our meeting via the phone was a bit like staging a family photo, with all the efforts at smoothing over difficulties of family life. 2 weeks later, with the family members staying in the house during the day, the daily grind of housework gained expression in our conversation. Besides cooking and cleaning, Ruby had to keep track of her increasingly forgetful mother, who was wandering in the neighborhood. I asked Tito how Tito was doing. Was he worse? Better? She replied, It's that, geez, Tito has me fed up, me tiene aburrida, right? Look, as you see yourself, his world is one in which he does not assimilate his schoolwork through the internet that the teacher is giving him. He says that he will no longer see the psychologist. It makes me angry, me da rabia, because you know what? They directed him to have therapy at home, the COSAM. They directed him to get up early, make a work routine. He has lost the rhythm of the house. He lives in his world. Sitting in bed next to her husband, Ruby lists a whole range of different ailments, breaking out in hives, a bout of diarrhea that Tito has experienced in the past 2 weeks. A tone mixing unease and frustration creeps into her voice, and he does not like to go out on the street. And when I went to La Vega, the large market in central Santiago, he said, "Why did you go? Pucha, stop leaving the house. See, you're going to get infected." Perhaps trying to smooth over the madness, her husband interjects, saying that Tito fears the street because of the risk of a relapse into drugs. Ruby responds, "Yes, that's right, that it may very well be that he does not want to return to the same thing, that he is scared of having a relapse." While Tito found he could confide in the psychologist from the COSAM, Ruby now has to prod him to answer the phone. Quote, "But now I say, in a robotic and weary tone, take the telephone because they will try to call you, Tito. Get it? Tito. Eat. Tito." What was 2 weeks before presented as a re-encounter with family now has transfigured into a scene of estrangement in which Ruby describes Tito as having lost the rhythm of the house. This spurs Ruby to begin the search for further treatment through the COSAM. As I would hear from Ruby 2 weeks later, the psychiatrist diagnosed Tito as having, quote, anxiety problems, gave him a prescription of Seroquel, and advised Ruby that he would need to work with the psychologist to develop habits within the house. But at this point, other stories were also surfacing. 3 days before our meeting with Ruby, before our third meeting, Ruby texts me on WhatsApp. "Hi, Clarita. It seems that yesterday I collapsed and at night I had a headache, and I comment, 'My mom wants to die and does not want to eat or get out of bed. I took her out of bed and made her dance. I made her bed and arranged her room. And on the other side, Tito is doing worse. He does not want to eat well. At lunchtime, I got so angry, I took away his plate of food and threw it away. And to round it off, Lorena came several times to the house when I was not here, and we agreed that she would not come. She came again when I was here, and her nose was red and damaged. We argued, and she is jalando, snorting pasta base. She is screwing up her life. It gives me a lot of pain. She does not find any sense to her life. The other day, she commented to me that she is bored of life, and she would have preferred to be in prison." Let me pick up one of these stories. As I mentioned earlier, Lorena, Ruby's second oldest sister, had endured years of domestic violence at the hands of her husband, Juan. When Ruby lived in her mother's house, she often called the police to protect her sister, but Lorena defended Juan when the police arrived. When Ruby and her husband moved into their own house, Lorena soon became a constant presence there with her infant son, Brian. The sheer existence of the infant seemed to provoke a rage in Juan. I remember sitting in the living room with the sisters, surrounded by paperwork. Brian lying on a blanket on the floor crying. Ruby and Lorena asked me to read one form after another, asking me to decipher the physician's handwritten note. Multiform hydrocephalus was written down on one sheet. "Is there a cure?" Ruby had asked me. I remember I gave an uncertain response. "He will need to be seen by doctors again to know how best to help him." August 7th, 2020, 3 months into the second quarantine, Brian is now 18 years old. When I asked Ruby how things are going in the house, she begins from this story. Let's start with the family problems. Tito's illness is dropped for the time being. Another story is picked up, a story of the failure of institutions. The day before, Ruby had contacted the social worker in the COSAM to intern Brian in a long-term care facility. She remarks, quote, "He spends the day topado, doped on drugs. He hit 2 people. He destroyed stores, ha hecho tira negocios. He's now an adult. He has to be hospitalized. But Brian says no, he will not allow himself to be interned. He himself has a mental disability. Lorena is falling back into drugs. Her children están en otro. They're not paying attention. I was talking to the social worker who asked if this was the first time I was contacting them. What are you talking about? I have gone on 3 years filling documents, going to family courts. Getting to court, we could arrive to the point where he is made a ward of the state. When Brian entered adolescence, he began to escape from the house and ride the bus. He ended up on the opposite side of the city, in the southern municipality of Puente Alto, where a group of teenage boys gave him marijuana laced with other substances and egged him on to rob various neighborhood stores. He was arrested for robbery and interned in the psychiatric hospital for 3 months, just as his mother was sentenced to 2 years in prison for petty drug trafficking. Ruby became his temporary guardian. After his release, he moved between Ruby's house, his sister's house down the street, and the mediagua he shared with his mother, Lorena, at his grandmother's house. But most days, he found his way back to Puente Alto. Ruby recounts a scene of an attempt to intern him in the hospital shortly before his mother was released from prison. In this scene, the disease goes beyond the hands of the family, and institutions, one after the other, deny the family help. Brian had stolen the scooter of a close family friend suffering from Parkinson's disease. As Ruby's husband, her eldest son, and the friend went searching for the scooter, Ruby received a phone call from the police commissary in a neighboring municipality. He was already being held by police. When they arrived at the commissary to pick him up, Brian refused to get into the car. Her husband was so, quote, furious that his blood pressure shot up, producing a, quote, hemorrhage in his eye, resulting in a loss of vision. As Ruby recounts the story, her voice is tinged with anger, and they left, se fueron. Ruby was left alone with Brian in the commissary. But the failures of family slide into the denials of institutions to see. He, or Brian, comes up to me and he threatens to kill me. And the cop says, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he does this to me, pa. He had taken one of those machines that gives out soft drinks and he threw it. And the cop picked him up and said, "Okay, senora, we have to take him to his house." No, no, no. Like this, I will not take him. This is Ruby's voice. I will not take him. Usted, you do what you do with him. Look how aggressive he is. It's that, senora, this is the police. We can't do anything with him. He said to me, yeah, the only thing we can do then is to take him to the psychiatric hospital, the psiquiátrico. And the cops left me there at the entrance with Brian and se fueron, using a similar tone when she described her husband and son leaving her with Brian in the commissary. And I was asking, please give Brian, and then Brian gives me a manotazo, a slap. And those idiots, the hospital staff, just staying there. And then she goes between these voices, the staff voice. What do you need? No. Ruby voice. I want you to intern him for me. I want you to see what he is doing. I was filming with a cell phone. The staff voice. Is that, senora, you need to, what? Look at what he is doing. And Brian did this, raising her hand up into a fist. He was going to punch me. And a gentleman who was walking with his son put himself in between. Hey, do something. This child is crazy. He's aggressive. And they didn't want to. They didn't want to open the doors. And you know what? I started to film them. Yo me puse a grabarlo, to film all of them. An idiot doctor comes out and he says to me, Brian, what's going on with you? Tranquilo, tranquilo, tranquilo. He begins to say to him. And Brian is looking at him like this with a surprised look. Repeats, tranquilo, I want to go inside. And he enters with the guy, and the doctor says, yes, what is happening with the child is that he is consuming drugs outside, and because of that, he is like this. Ruby's voice, I don't care if he's consuming. Look at the conditions that are here. Look at the conditions that are here. The psychiatrist's voice, yes, but we cannot make ourselves responsible for him because he is going through this process. He has to take these pills. Ruby, look, you are doctor, but we are living the reality with him. Pero nosotros estamos viviendo la realidad con él. And so the thing is that I was going to leave, and the idiots closed the door so that I could not leave. And then another person arrived who was there and opened the door for me. The staff voice, is it that, Senora, you can't wait for this person, Brian, because we cannot take him here? Ruby voice, I don't know. You all are the ones responsible because you see how he is with me. The first one had closed the door like this, bang, but the other person who was there opened the front gate and let me out. They called me and called me. Ruby refused to pick up the phone, so they began to call other relatives. Finally, a niece and her husband picked up Brian from the psychiatric hospital and brought him back to their house. He was prescribed an injectable drug, one that kept him dopado, but even so, he flew into rages. 6 months prior to the start of our interviews, around December 2019, Lorena was released from prison on parole. Made to wear an ankle bracelet, she was confined to her home after 10 p.m. through the night. Upon her release, the guardianship of Brian transferred back to Lorena from Ruby. Brian, too, moved back from his sister's house to stay with his mother. Brian was becoming increasingly violent toward his mother and destructive of the house. But at night, Lorena could not leave the house without breaking parole because of her conditions of nighttime house arrest. Ruby's effort to get the paperwork done, contact the social worker, and have a hearing in family court seemed to be filled with a dread that Lorena's hold on life might be loosening with this accumulation of violence. Brian's violence towards her, the economic deprivation, and the prolongation of house-based confinement with the ankle bracelet because the court hearing was postponed multiple times due to pandemic restrictions. Here we might see in this effort of paperwork the subtle triaging of family members, but this triaging occurs with an overwhelming knowledge. Trying to keep a future open is this labor to keep a sister alive. As Ruby said to me, quote, this paperwork will go to tribunales because this is the only way so that Brian can understand and ultimately for Lorena to have a bit of peace. Because Lorena came out of prison with a different disposition. She came with many aspirations and with many desires to do things, but her children have pulled her down. And I said to the social worker, you know, Liliana, this is a social worker, a day will arrive when my sister will be dead, quedar muerta, because she will kill herself. So at least from me, of everything that I spoke to her today, the woman, the social worker, was like, wow, she assimilated it. And now I have her in WhatsApp. I sent her the documentation, and on Monday I will send another form, the only form that I need to do. But Ruby's work to care for Lorena is shadowed by a crisis within the family, intensified by the policing in the neighborhood. For Lorena was not the only one arrested for trafficking 3 years ago. In the drug raid, the police investigations also arrested Ruby's older sister, Soledad. The raid was broadcast live on a major news channel. This is a common practice, in fact. Footage of Lorena and Soledad, both face down on the ground, being handcuffed, circulated nationally, but more importantly, throughout the neighborhood and within municipal offices where Ruby worked. Police searched the neighborhood daycare where Soledad worked. They confiscated baby formula scoops and a scale used for mixing baby formula, deeming them tools for the drug trade. As Ruby relates to me the story of the raid, I notice how she repeatedly emphasizes Soledad, but not Lorena as her, quote, sister. Quote, I had spoken with the Rati, this is the police investigations, who was in charge of the drug raid, and he found out that I was working for the municipality. And the guy, somehow he knew that the mayor supported me. I told him that they were doing an injustice. They were doing an injustice with my sister Soledad. You don't know the huge damage that you are doing. But what is happening is that your sister is involved. No, this is a lie. What does my sister Soledad have to do with this? I am not talking about Lorena because I already know what was going on with Lorena. I already made other people aware of this. When the PDI searched Soledad's home, they found one fresh stem of marijuana, which she took as tea to assuage the pain from her brain tumor. When her case was brought before the judge, the charges for drug trafficking were dropped. But as if the law were simply to mete out a punishment, She was charged with possession without authorization of marijuana, made to sign at the police station every month for 1 year and pay a fine. Due to the public scandal, the daycare fired her, despite the voices of the neighborhood who supported her and protested her treatment, from the neighborhood council to the neighbors who own storefronts, to the neighbors on the street. As Ruby said, quote, "The only thing that is positive inside all of this is that the neighbors, all of them, were always a positive support. Always, always. Soledad knew that the storefront over there, the neighbors on the street, and afterward, with Lorena inside or incarcerated. More, they greeted my sister. Send greetings to Lorena. Pucha, I hope that she comes out and she takes care of herself inside." The drug raid, the incarceration, and publicity was not simply an event that leaves sequelae. It darkened the whole of their world. She asked me if I remember how Lorena would always defend her when she heard others talk about Ruby behind her back, and we started to laugh about this. Quote, "She was always chiloca, like crazy in the positive sense. It's chorra, like brave or courageous. It's this that she has lost. After a sister chorra, she ended up being a sister sumisa, submissive. That is like a little chicken. And Soledad, her happiness, her pretty face, passes before me. I have never seen it since. Sister embittered. It left a sister that carries a lot of rage. I have had her many times with me. And one day she said to me that the tumor is doing very badly. She was with me, quote, "I love you, sister, and I am of you, yo soy de ti." But she said to me, "I will die with this pain." Ruby's voice trembles as she says this. Ruby relates that she confronted the police investigations detective, quote, "The guy apologized to me, me pidió disculpas. What is the purpose of an apology? I told him, you killed my sister's world." So she's saying, you killed my world, right? What you really need to do is your vocation. You killed your vocation. You do not have ethics. People like you do damage to the world. Tell me, who believes in justice? If the justice is of you all, dime, ¿quién cree en la justicia si la justicia es de ustedes? And so it is with this whole of this darkened world that permeates Ruby's navigation of social work and mental health bureaucracy tied to psychiatric institutions, the police, and the family courts. But it is also from this darkened world that Ruby tries to make possible a different future for the family. Just a week before the first lockdown was imposed in Santiago at the end of March 2020, Ruby went from bank to bank in search of a loan. Her friend Ingrid had offered to sell her a piece of land in the south. Ruby and her husband Hector had long dreamed of leaving Santiago and starting anew in the south, with their eldest son David, his partner and children, Ruby's mother, and particularly their son Tito and Ruby's sister Lorena. When the chance suddenly appeared, Ruby seized it. After multiple rejections, she secured a loan from a third-rate bank with steep interest rates. Nevertheless, with eyes closed, she signed. She took on a 15 million peso loan, about $18,000 to buy the land and consolidate her existing debt. By the end of July 2020, both Ruby and her husband withdrew 10% of their pensions, which the government had made available as an economic mitigation measure for the impacts of the pandemic. This 10% would not be used to fulfill basic necessities. In contrast to one of the households that I followed in which all adult family members lost their jobs due to movement restrictions, similar to other households I followed, the 10% was used as a lump sum to help secure future possibilities, be that in terms of making major improvements on the house, paying down as much existing debt as possible, or using it to pay for a child's education. Ruby and her husband set aside their 10% to construct housing on the land in the south. August 18th, 2020. 2 weeks have passed since Ruby spoke with a social worker and sent Brian's documentation via WhatsApp. But the paperwork that Ruby gathered from different mental health institutions, the COSAM and the Psychiatric Institute, contained conflicting diagnoses. While the psychiatrist in the COSAM diagnosed Brian with schizophrenia, the psychiatrist in the Psychiatric Institute diagnosed him with addiction and severe developmental disability. A diagnosis of schizophrenia would qualify Brian to stay in a group home covered by national health insurance, Plan Auge. As Ruby calls back and forth with a social worker, her fears that Lorena may take her life intensify. One day prior to my interview with Ruby, Lorena had called her saying, "No one helps me. I feel alone. I'm in the mood to do the crazy. Me dan ganas de hacer la loca," to kill herself. Ruby tried to remind her of why to live. Don't even do what is occurring to you. Remember that we have plans. Lorena continued, "I don't want anything. I don't want to come back." Ruby, alarmed, said she would go find her. "Where are you?" But Lorena cuts off the call, ending with, "I will see, because I don't have anything left." Ruby called the social worker, demanding that she call Lorena. "Remember, I told you it may be that she tries to take her life, and I say to you that you all will be responsible, because I will put in a legal complaint." A few hours later, Lorena called. The social worker had taken her to the COSAM. That night, relieved that Lorena was now picking up the phone, Ruby took the Seroquel prescribed to Tito to, quote, be able to sleep. A few days later, however, as Ruby is on the phone with the social worker, walking up to Lorena's house, Lorena rushes out of the house, chased by Brian. He shoves Ruby to the ground. Neighbors jump in to stop him. A jumble of fists ensue. She brings Lorena to her house, where, quote, the only thing she did was tremble. Ruby recounts, I said to her, I took her and I said, "No, let's go, Lorena, let's go. Leave here." And I began to walk with her. I didn't want to take the bus. I wanted to walk with her. It was like, wow. So we walked over there, talking to her about positive things, took her over there, bought a soft drink, a small snack, and so we continued walking. And she told me she's going to give over Brian to make him a ward of the state. Okay, forget about Brian, forget it. I don't know how many hours we were walking there in the center of Santiago. Not even one cop. Nothing. We walked with masks, of course. We walked until we were both relaxed, as much her as me. When they returned to La Pincoya, Ruby makes arrangements with her brother Jose's wife for Lorena to stay with them for at least a few nights. When we meet via WhatsApp on September 9th, 2020, the quarantine has been lifted in the municipality of Huachoraba. Ruby, her husband, her eldest son, and his partner, along with their friend Ingrid, are now making preparations to leave that same week for Santa Barbara for 4 days. Her talk is filled with aspirations and plans. They will plant fruit trees and construct beehives. They will export honey and marmalade. Lorena will work the land with her. And even if their son Tito has become a cabro de la población, a kid of the población, Ruby projects a future in which this child would be healed by starting anew outside of the city. With all this work for the future, the immediacy of resolving the situation with Brian begins to fade. The voices of neighbors, however, bring this immediacy back momentarily. As Ruby tells me, look, at least things have been tranquil in contrast to other times. It's just Brian. Brian is the one practically who has the problems with Lorena, problems with the rest. One of the neighbors told me, by the way, she's kind of rough. She said, hey, listen, Brian, hey, listen, do you all concern yourselves with Brian? I said to her, I always preoccupy myself with Brian. Yes, of course, but his mother does not preoccupy herself. You know what? My son and my grandchildren are scared because Brian, when he passes by the house, by the fencing, he bothers them. They see Brian and they exit running. Okay, what do you want me to do? Here, it is not our fault, like referring to herself and Lorena and their family. That is the state. The state institutions, do not intern him. What would you like us to do? Put him in a subterranean cage? We cannot have the child like that. Se arrancas, he escapes. I have done everything that is possible. You all, ustedes, are those who need to make a complaint to the state so that they can help us. That is the form by which you all can help. But even then, Liliana, the social worker, has not called me because they are absorbed in the demand that has occurred from within the overall context of the pandemic. And because I have been in other things, como he estado en otro, well, we have left it at the point where there was going to be this demand, the legal demand in the family court, that Brian would be interned as soon as possible. Ruby's demand that the neighborhood and the state help the family shows how the domestic can never be taken for granted as a site of sentimental domesticity separated from the street. Rather, domestics are forged through the encounters with state institutions and the neighborhood, such that what it is to achieve home can involve the opening of the doors by institutions, the phone call from the psychologist or social worker, and the letters by neighbors. Domestics can also be forged in the labor for a different future, as with the work to live on a plot of land in the south, or in recounting the moments of love amidst volatility. This is how I receive Ruby's words of being an other, in which the immediacy of finding a place for Brian ever so slightly recedes. In Being an Other, stories around Tito emerge again, this time recounting an online meeting between Ruby, Hector, and the subdirector, teachers, and psychologist in Tito's high school 2 weeks prior, where they brought up Tito's leading role in organizing student mobilization that sparked the Estadio Social. In describing to me what Tito did, Ruby shifts to addressing him as you. To you, they love you, not just because they are loving people or caring people for their students, but because you had an action that stayed caught for the whole life of the professor. Una acción que le quedó grabado por toda su vida la profesora. That you said, no one will take photos, no one is going to do a show. We are going to protest because we need to make changes, and we cannot be enduring the fact that people are continuing to suffer. I don't want anybody waking up a clown. Here we will fight. We will give the fight as it corresponds. This is what Tito said, more or less. And when they did the first action, when they occupied the metro, tomaron el metro, he led it. Él le encabezó. And at his school, there was a tremendous protest. The cops arrived and began to grab kids. Empezaron a agarrar. There were 5 compañeros. The compañeros had fear in the protest, but they still came to accompany Tito. And the cops wanted to arrest the kids, and he said, no, they have nothing to do with it. Leave them. Cops, tal por cual, come and get me. And the cops got pissed and started to run after Tito and the compañeros, and so the compañeros could leave. And Tito, he was arrested. Le tomaron preso. And he said to me, Mama, you know why I was arrested? Me fui preso because I could not allow my compañeros to get arrested. Less those two, because their mom is not a mom like you. It would be possible that the parents would throw them out of their house if they were arrested. But this attitude that Tito has in his being, I say to Tito, this will go complimenting you while you are able to have your own career. In this way, we converse a lot with Tito. 1 month later, in early October, a beloved neighbor, Marci, passes away of liver cancer. 2 months before her death, Francisco, her husband, died of what might have been COVID. But given the collapse of public hospitals in the face of an explosion of case rates and the difficulties of accessing care with movement restrictions, what counts as a COVID-19 death is not clear. Due to pandemic restrictions, no velorio was held for Francisco. The burial was limited to Marci and their daughter. As participants in the original toma that had made the neighborhood of La Pincoya, the neighborhood mourned heavily Francisco's and now Marci's death. The daughters held the velorio for Marci in their parents' house. It was during this velorio that we see how the possibilities are held open by the concrete neighbor. As Ruby recounted, quote, so the daughter of Marci recounted to me everyone was moved with Brian, because Brian came in the very first hour that Marci arrived and hugged her and began to cry. Marci, he said, Marci, why are you not here, Marci? He said. It turned out that Brian always stopped by their house, and when he came, he would stay for some time. With Francisco the same, and he cried, and you know what? He put himself next to the coffin, and he stayed there all day. They told him it was time to leave. He put on reggaeton music, and she's giving this laugh almost like uncomfortably. I think he came with his own speaker, and he said, so that Marci hears the music. And he was there looking, but not touching the flowers. He hugged her again and again, started to cry. You know why? Because they were very loving to Brian. Eran muy amoroso con él. At the very beginning of the day, they knew that all of a sudden when Brian showed up, he was arriving without having eaten breakfast. So Marci had some bread for him. He would start eating next to the bingo over there and afterwards run off. So they gave him a lot of cariño. And all of us were taken aback, like, wow. Seeing him, and he didn't cry when his father died. No, for Brian, these were exactly the worst times he had because Juan punished him so much. And when Juan passed away, he did not cry. For that reason, when I heard this and thought, of course, in contrast, they gave him so much cariño, so much that they cared, que se preocupan. So here, aquí, they have been here. Just as Rui pauses in our conversation, Tito enters the bedroom. I'm unable to see him, but I hear his voice, though it's a tone that sounded so utterly in other. Ruby to Tito, why are you asking me for money? And why don't you have what is here? Here there is food. Why are you asking for money? Tito, to eat, to drink, para comer, para tomar. Ruby, ahí está empezando eso. Tito, voy a buscar a alguien. Ruby, ¿de quién tiene que buscar? El Marco. ¿De qué está haciendo Tito? Tito, pásame algo. Ruby, busca, she says very gruffly. Tito, sipo. Ruby, don't appear here. Look, don't appear here. Mierda. The cajón de madera. She's like pointing at the wood box, sheer anger vibrating through her words. Ruby then turns to me. So it is very difficult with Tito because he thinks we are in the wrong and him, no. By way of conclusion, is this paper about COVID? Is this a paper about mental illness? In writing this paper, I have found that the challenge here is not only that COVID is dispersed within everyday life, it is also that everything happens, but in some quarters, this everything would be considered nothing at all, as it is simply the flux of everyday life, saturated by ominous fears, overwhelming scenes of care, the labor of holding open a future, and near imperceptible forms of letting go. The method of this study, in the form of repeated surveys and interviews, lent conditions for us to engage context as that which is woven together through stories picked up, some dropped for the time being, only to be picked up differently. That is, the study was not about COVID-19 as if we took the pandemic as an object before us frontally. Rather, on a deeper level, we were asking what methods would allow a perspective from within the flux of everyday life in which COVID is dispersed. In this way, we can see the kind of kindred closeness to seeing like a child. With this method, the well-defined sites of the state depicted in other ethnographies start to fade, for the state leaves residues here and there in every little nook and cranny of everyday life, even as state actors and institutions claim themselves as victims to their own institutional norms. Recall Ruby's words, usted es doctor, pero nosotros estamos viviendo la realidad con él. Or, dime, ¿quién cree en la justicia si la justicia es de ustedes? And against this victim stance, Ruby draws on the gestures of filming, honed through contact with police in the neighborhood, and performs this within the context of another institutional violence, that of the quiet failure of the psychiatric institution, which fails to open its doors when people need help. It would iron out all of the texture to frame this long-term fieldwork with families as one of simply collecting longitudinal data, which would seem to hinge on a notion that data is simply added from the outside. Instead, the ongoing conversation with Ruby and her family for now over 25 years, since my early 20s, in fact, draws on a different set of stakes of engaging the normativity internal to the milieu through the various side paths and presented by and in a proliferation of stories and relations. These are stakes that simply grew with living a life within this conversation. In a very insightful essay on global risks, philosopher Pier Giorgio Donatelli discusses how Vina Das recasts the interplay of scale from one in terms of hard boundaries between the local and the global, to instead taking the point of view of the ordinary as the perspective from which the global and the catastrophic are explored. As he notes, this perspective shows how being seized by the global as a disembodied spectacle deflects attention to the detailed texture of events and responses to them. And, quote, ordinary competence that he urges us to explore in dealing with the problems that we are facing today, including, quote, what went wrong in the COVID-19 pandemic, including the uncanny and rapid oblivion of this gigantic fact that we are all experiencing, close quote. It may be that this paper presents us with a route into this, quote, uncanny, rapid oblivion of the gigantic fact of COVID-19 at the global scale. For it is not that COVID-19 was forgotten, but rather that COVID-19 marked the overall context beset by the immediacy of a host of multiple crises within everyday life. And from within this everyday life, so strained and deformed by these crises, kin, neighbors, and sometimes also figures of institutions, such as the psychologist and the teacher, muster a labor of love to keep a future open. To write on the COVID-19 pandemic is to bring the texture of this everyday life into view, in which stories overlap, recede, and are picked up again, now morphed into something else. It is to see how in a context marked by pandemic movement restrictions and intensified uncertainties, but also by repeated failures of institutions and state disordering by police, the world may be ever so darkened by the hints of a sister's letting go of life, or ordinary competencies rediscovered, as in the dawning to Ruby of the importance of the neighbor's cariño for Brian. In this way, COVID-19 marked life as a whole without being narrativized as such. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Clara, por nos colocar diante da complexidade que é a análise social quando se leva a sério a perspectiva da vida cotidiana. E muito obrigada a todos e a todas as pessoas pela presença.
Thank you.